Starting off this countdown, we have the prisoners. In 1902, American doctors stationed in the Philippines decided to do some experiments on their own. First, they withheld proper nutrition from 29 of their prisoners. They did so in order to induce beriberi, which is a disease caused by lack of vitamin B1. Lack of vitamin B1 can cause difficulty walking, loss of feelings in the hands and feet, and loss of muscle function. It can cause irreversible damage to your nervous system and heart, and they forced these prisoners into this. 4 of the test subjects died as a result. Then later that year, another physician decided to inject 5 prisoners with the bubonic plague. The prisoners had no clue about this, and they became very sick. Then, 4 years later, in 1906, Dr. Richard P. Strong infected more prisoners with cholera. All subjects became sick, and 13 of them sadly died. Most of the tests were done to see what disease they should use in case of biological warfare. In our 9th spot, we have Operation Big Itch. Operation Big Itch was the name given to a number of tests conducted at Dugway Proving Grounds in 1954. The experiments involved testing biological warfare on unexpected fleas. At least this time they used fleas and not real people. So the fleas were loaded into 2 types of munitions and then dropped from the air. After a bunch of trial and error, the operation was a success. Not only could the fleas survive the drop, but they also could still attach themselves onto the hosts, which were guinea pigs. These tests were done to see if it was possible to use infected fleas and drop them into an area to make people sick. That's not all though. In a project known as Operation Big Buzz, they decided to use mosquitoes. In May of 1955, over 300,000 uninfected mosquitoes were dropped over parts of the US state of Georgia. If it worked, they were going to infect these mosquitoes with yellow fever. These 2 are just some of the entomological warfare tests done in history. In our 7th spot, we have the plutonium experiments. Over the years, the US government has participated in a number of plutonium experiments. One of them involved a man named Albert Stevens. This man was misdiagnosed with stomach cancer and then was told he was going to receive treatment for this cancer. Meanwhile, he was just a test subject. He was injected with plutonium without even knowing. And then they said he was cured. He was led to believe that the treatment had cured him. In fact, he received the highest known accumulated radiation dose ever recorded. It should have been lethal. In the end, the plutonium remained present in his body for the remainder of his life, slowly decaying over the years. He ended up dying 20 years later from heart disease. And his ashes were actually stolen so that they could continue analyzing the radioactivity of this man. But they did this without the consent of his relatives. In our 6th spot, we have the burn victims. In the 1950s, researchers at the Medical College of Virginia performed a number of unethical experiments on burn victims. In particular, they targeted poor Black victims. These victims did not give their consent for these tests. They were then subjected to additional burning, experimental antibiotics, and injections of radioactive isotopes. Over a 10-year period, more than 770 patients were experimented on. 460 of them were African American. A number of people developed fluid loss and anemia from the severe burns that they were subjected to. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the chemicals. From 1950 to 1953, the US Army conducted a number of experiments over 6 cities in the US and Canada. The tests were to see the dispersal patterns of chemical weapons. So they sprayed chemicals all over these cities. Some of the chemicals being zinc cadmium sulfide, which was thought to not be harmful. One place affected by these sprays was Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. They were informed that they were testing a chemical fog to protect Winnipeg in the event of a Russian attack. So they said that this fog was going to be a defense study, which was a lie. Although it was said to be a small dose that they were exposed to, in some urban environments, people were exposed to higher levels. And because of how small the size of the particles were, it made it more dangerous according to a scientist, due to the fact that they could get lodged deeper into people's respiratory systems. Thankfully, no one died from the tests, but it's so sketchy how they lied about it all. Like, yeah, we're doing these tests to protect you. Just kidding! In our 4th spot, we have the Holmesburg Program. From 1951 to 1974, a number of dermatological experiments took place in Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania. The studies were performed by Dr. Albert M. Kligman on behalf of the US Army, Dow Chemical Company, and Johnson & Johnson. The test started with looking at health effects of dioxin and other herbicides on the human body. So they exposed some patients to these chemicals, and years later, a number of them developed a variety of health problems like lupus. So they actually sued the professor. But that didn't stop him from continuing on with these experiments. In fact, he increased the amount of dioxin that the people were exposed to. He applied 7,500 milligrams of dioxin. That's 468 times the dosage of the first test, which still made people ill. The prisoners developed a number of terrible inflammatory pustules and papules. That's not all though. In 1967, the US Army paid Kligman to apply skin blistering chemicals to the faces and backs of inmates so they could learn how the skin protects itself from toxic chemicals in case of attack. One creepy report from Kligman said, and I quote, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." That's disgusting. In our third spot, we have the FP45 Liberator, which was anything but liberating. This was a failed weapon that was going to be used by the US military during World War I. Since it was small, it could be made cheaper and more of them could be produced. The plan was to have these weapons airdropped to the soldiers. They then were going to use these weapons to kill enemy troops before stealing their weapons. Plus, they thought that enemies would be intimidated when they see all these weapons being airdropped to them. They wanted to strike fear into them. The US produced 1 million of these weapons, but it was all for nothing. The whole thing was found impractical and ineffective, and a waste of time and money. In our second spot, we have the Dorset Experiments. Between 1953 to 1975, a series of experiments were done to see how far one ship or aircraft could spread a biological warfare agent over the UK. These experiments were referred to as the Dorset Biological Warfare Experiments. Between 1961 to 1968, more than 1 million people along the south coast of England were exposed to E. coli and Bacillus globigi. It was spread by a military ship anchored off of the Dorset coast, spraying the organisms towards them. That was just one experiment out of many. Another one included releasing a bacteria in the London Underground at lunchtime to see how far it would spread. In fact, people close to where the trials took place became very sick. Women miscarried, other kids were born with cerebral palsy or had birth defects. They blame these experiments. And in our number one spot today, we have the Irradiation Experiments. Between 1960 to 1971, the Department of Defense funded a number of radiation experiments. These experiments, again, were conducted without the person's consent and was mainly performed on poor and black patients with cancer. The patients were told that they were receiving a treatment that might cure their cancer, which was a lie. Instead, researchers were seeing the effects that high levels of radiation would have on the human body. Imagine thinking that these doctors were here to help you, but in the end, you were just one big test subject for them. And they weren't helping you. In the end, it made patients worse.
Kicking off the list at number 10. Kola Superdeep Borehole. If you dug a hole through the center of the earth and then jumped in, would you come out on the other side? No, definitely not. It's not a cartoon. But in the Arctic Circle in the 70s, Russia had a budget for such a thing, believe it or not. Scientists began working on the project in 1970. They got about 40,000 feet come 1989. So for that many years, Russian dudes in winter coats were just drilling one hole. What a great job, I love this. They got 1/3 through the Baltic continental crust. They found rocks older than 2 billion years, but eventually they hit this muddy lava and had to pack it up and go back, well, up. A huge concern here was that demons would be released from the earth. I was gonna laugh, but honestly, that's fair. It's more than fair. Back in the 70s as well, I would have believed it. The previous title for the deepest hole belonged to the United States Bertha Rogers Hole, which reached 31,000 feet. Stanley Yelnats would be so proud. Number 9, the mouse with an ear on its back. If we ever reboot Stuart Little, this guy needs to audition. He would kill it. It'd be so weird. R-rated for sure. The mouse with a human ear, folks, this is like the world's greatest mouse spy. I don't know, he could do so much. What the hell are we looking at here? Well, back in 1997, if scientists could grow cartilage using chondrocytes, aka cells from a cow. Well, it worked, and we're still talking about it today, obviously, but it all started when Joseph Viconti, pediatric surgeon, began designing human organs. That's a fun little hobby, just designing organs. I think this one looks real. Now, this was during a shortage. He wasn't just bored and started to make ears. He was changing the medical game, and little did he know he was about to change the science one as well. He constructed a simple small ear, told his brother Chuck and his partner Bob to not bring up the fact that he attached it to a mouse. Well, Chuck spilled the beans, but now we know that cartilage can indeed create cells. I really want to Q-tip his back. Is that weird? gives ear cheese a whole new meaning. So gross, tossing that away. Number 8, the Trinity test and the Manhattan Project. In a list about unsettling science experiments, I have to bring up these tests. Of course, history changed forever when nuclear fission was discovered in a Berlin lab. They discovered that an atom splitting into lighter atoms can cause quite the chemical reaction, this massive explosion. This was groundbreaking, of course, because this was the moment we discovered a new way to power technology. But at the same time, the test introduced us to atomic bombs. When the Americans heard that Germans were developing nuclear weapons, they joined in with their development on a project basically out of fear. Most of it being done in New Mexico. So in 1939, President Roosevelt got scientists, military officials, this whole team of brilliant individuals to figure out how to use uranium as a weapon. The government eventually started to fund this research, which was happening at Columbia University, and in 1942 engineers from the army joined as well, and following Pearl Harbor, well, that's when President Roosevelt transitioned the project into a military branch completely, and so began the Manhattan Project. Roosevelt made this project with the strict goal of weaponizing nuclear energy. There are facilities in New Mexico, Tennessee, Washington, and here in Canada. Finally, come July 16, 1945, the Trinity test was conducted. The first atomic bomb was detonated in that New Mexico desert and was deemed a success, with mushroom clouds reaching up to 40,000 feet high. Number 5, the search for ET. With UFOs showing up on the news lately, you gotta wonder how much money does the government actually put in to the exploration of possible alien life? Well, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or SETI, is a program put in place for just that. The institution is America's only organization dedicated to finding ET and his little glowy finger. I wouldn't put a chip in my head, but I would let ET put his finger in my ear for sure. Long distance? Are you kidding? Let's go. They've been at work there for over 50 years, and by at work I mean they're searching the galaxy for radio signals. So far we haven't found anything, which is almost more concerning, some would say. Number 4, Go pills. Look out, 5-hour energy, because we're pulling an all-nighter for this one. Every time I watch Lord of the Rings, I fall asleep. I can't help it. It's a great film, don't get me wrong, but it's so cozy, the music just tucks me right in. But that's not an issue in the real world. The real issue is overnight truck drivers struggling to stay awake to pay their bills. That's a bit more important, I'd say. That's where Go pills were supposed to come into play. The pill that keeps you up for 40 hours straight. And no, I don't mean that pill. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, again, DARPA, is currently funding this pill. The benefits it would have, I gotta say, if this works, I'm on board. I can finally finish Skyrim. Wouldn't that be neat? I can finally play 50 turns in a single round of Mario Party. It can finally happen. I knew it was possible, Chris. Number 3, Large Hadron Collider. The world's largest and most powerful particle accelerator is intimidating. When I say large, I also mean it's 27 kilometers long. Big circle of pipes. This huge metal circle made out of superconducting magnets and accelerating structures located in Switzerland has one goal in mind: making two particles collide. All in the name of science, of course. While it's exciting to be a part of history, we're kind of concerned about the fact that a black hole might just appear in Switzerland, out of the blue. This project began back in 2008, and the odds that they can smash two particles together in the first place is pretty rare. Being that far apart and in opposite directions going that fast, they say it's like shooting sewing needles from 10 kilometers away and somehow having their tips collide. So don't sleep in fear. Plus, if a mini black hole did appear, scientists say it would evaporate instantly. Although I've seen Interstellar, so I call bullshit. Number 2, the Milgram Experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test for example, and how that led to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and how people, like the Germans, were so easily influenced into doing what they did. So the Milgram Experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions? Specifically, how far will they go if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test, and there's 3 important roles for this one. There's the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're in on it. The real subject is the teacher, the one administering pain to the test subject. They're told by this higher figure to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They keep zapping them. So the real test is to see how far humans will go when hurting others. The icing on this experiment is that the subject isn't actually getting shocked at all. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. Imagine taking a wrong turn on your way to class and you end up here. What a nightmare. But basically, it's like you have a figure of authority yelling commands at you, and it's like, okay, people, as a human, we're just gonna accept that and just go along with it. It's like if Vince Vaughn was being all funny and and he's all tall and big and intimidating. He's like, yeah, come on, do it. You're like, ah, it's Vince Vaughn, he told me to. And then after they're like, you failed. It's Vince Vaughn, like you're an idiot. Number 1, MK Ultra. We have to finish with a mind control project, of course, it's the only way. You will like this video after you're done. MK Ultra was a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973, where they ran hundreds of experiments to US citizens. They gave them LSD and other narcotics in attempts to crack mind control, or as they call it, information gathering. Okay. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, the Chinese, or the North Korean agents were using mind control on them. I mean, sure, how else can you explain brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea? Not like they hurt them or did anything horrible. The program had subjects take LSD, hallucinogens, paralytics, electric shock therapy, just horrible stuff being done in universities, hospitals, and even prisons. The happenings of said project weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended, but the agency destroyed most MK documents back in 1973 when it collapsed. So we think we know things, but in reality we probably know nothing, Jon Snow.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Octagon City. This city was created in 1856 and was meant to be a place only for vegetarians to live in Texas. It got its name Octagon City due to the fact that their homes were shaped as octagons. The designer of the city believed that this was a more practical design for homes as it let in more light. Plus, he wanted the town square to also be an octagon shape. From there, the city was going to be made up of 4 octagon villages, farmhouses, and other public buildings. But it turned out to be nothing like the residents expected. About 60 families came from all over the country to live there, and they were all disappointed. Their homes were 16 by 16 windowless log cabins. Yeah, definitely not what they expected. Not only that, but they faced a number of other problems like lack of water, bad mosquitoes, and disease. This all contributed to the downfall of the city. But there are still a few octagon houses that remain there if you want to visit them today. Little fun fact. Moving on to number 9, we have Cloud 9. aka the floating city. Yes, you heard me correctly, a floating city. During the mid-20th century, inventor Buckminster Fuller said that he was going to fix the overcrowding situation in Tokyo by creating a city in the sky. How was he gonna do this? Well, he was going to make a bunch of giant geodesic spheres and fill them with air. He planned on then heating the air with solar power or human activity, and then said that the sphere would just float. Now you might be like, well, won't they fly away? Don't worry, he thought this through. He would then anchor the sphere to mountains or other structures to keep them from flying around. Obviously, for many reasons, this was a complete fail and the city was never built. In our 8th spot, we have the Death Star. Any fans of Star Wars here? Well, did you know that in the late 16th century, the Venetian Republic created a brand new city that was basically like the Death Star in Star Wars? It was known as Palmanova. It was meant to be a utopia for its residents, but also a military force. It had high walls, a moat, and other defenses to keep enemies out. The only problem is that people refused to live there. They thought it would entice the Ottomans to try and attack them. Like, by creating something to keep people out, we'll just make them want to try and get in. So Palmanova was a flop. Nowadays, it's a popular tourist attraction though. Moving on to number 7, we have Fordlandia, Brazil. In 1927, Henry Ford thought it would be a good idea to create a massive rubber plantation in the jungles of Brazil. He named it Fordlandia. He designed the towns to have swimming pools, a golf course, and bungalows. So it sounds pretty nice, right? A utopian community in the middle of the Brazilian jungle. Well, think again. Ford's plan was to get a lot of rubber from the trees of the Amazons for car tires and such. He was in the middle of a rubber shortage, so he thought he would outsource Brazil. But unfortunately, his whole plan failed. The trees ended up getting a bad leaf fungus and died. Then his team and him got into multiple disputes with the Brazilian laborers, and then they started a number of riots. It was a pretty big fall, so he shut it down in 1945 and sold the land to the Brazilian government. All that remains there are a couple of structures overgrown by nature. Moving on to number 6, we have the Drop City. Drop City was founded in 1965 by a bunch of students who joined forces to buy a plot of land in Colorado. They wanted to create a utopian commune for artists or creative people. It was named Drop City because the idea was you drop out of your current city and join this one. So they marked the community as a place where creative people could share meals and ideas, where everybody had a say and nobody ran the show. Turns out that a lot of people were here here for this. In fact, they had a huge influx of people into their community that they actually started suffering from overcrowding. Then they suffered from personality conflicts, and by 1968 the city was abandoned. The structures have since been dismantled, but there are still some ruins left there. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Magnitogorsk. Created under the rule of Stalin, this town was supposed to be an industrial powerhouse and a workers' paradise. Everyone was going to live in a large community with apartment blocks and endless sunlight. Children would have places to play, and residents would compete against each other to improve the city. But that never happened. When volunteers first arrived to build the city, there was absolutely nothing there, so they had to sleep in tents in the freezing cold winter temperatures. During the first winter, tons of workers died. In fact, they would have carts sent out around the camp each morning to collect all the bodies. Then in the summer, they faced terrible dust storms that buried workers alive. In less than a year, so many workers passed away that all the volunteers were like, F this, and then they fled. To make matters worse, when the workers left, thousands of prisoners were sent to take their place, and it turned into a giant slave labor camp. In our 4th spot, we have Pruitt, Igoe. In 1949, architect Minoru Yamasaki was going to create a community that would change US housing forever. He created 17 apartment buildings that were 11 stories high on the edge of St. Louis and called it Pruitt, Igoe. It was said to be a paradise for middle-class individuals. The grand opening of this town was broadcast in 1954 on live TV. That same year though, the Supreme Court declared segregation in schools was unconstitutional. Well, all the residents in this town were white, and then they were scared that people of color were going to be allowed to live with them, so they left. And that is extremely messed up. As a result, Pruitt, Igoe became completely abandoned. At one point, raw sewage was flowing down the hallways of the apartment buildings. That's how neglected it became. But it was the perfect place for drug gangs to set up shop and for poor individuals to live. And that's what they did. Soon it became a very dangerous housing project. By 1972, the buildings were demolished. Moving on to number 3, we have the nudist colony. If you're an open and free individual who hates wearing clothes, then this community would have been perfect for you. Founded in 1895 in Washington State, this community was supposed to be a place where people could do whatever they wanted. In the end, they accidentally created a nudist colony. People were like, screw clothes and government rules, let's just walk around naked. But not everyone was keen on this. As a result, it started a war between the nudes and the prudes, as they called it. These groups would fight constantly. Eventually, it was so bad that it led to the fall of the community after about a decade. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Fruitlands. Founded in 1843 in Harvard, Massachusetts, Fruitlands was meant to be a utopian community for vegans. But the community was very, very strict. They were only allowed to drink water, nothing else. And no animals were ever to be used in farming. The most ridiculous thing of all was that they weren't allowed to even plant or grow root vegetables because it was said to disturb the worms. In the end, by the winter of that year, the community was completely out of food, forcing their residents to leave. Nowadays, the original farmhouse is still there if you want to visit. It's just been turned into a museum.